Welcome to Merschman Seeds Cup of Joe. On this episode, Kris Ehler from Ehler Bros is on location in Champaign County, Illinois. Hear all about Kris's experience planting Merschman soybeans using Starting Line Plus with Saltro and Trunemco, and how he pushes growing season as early in the year as he can. You can find Kris at the social media links in the description.
Hi, this is Joe Merschman. Welcome to Merschman Seeds Cup of Joe. Today we have Ben, Lynn, and Turk. Also, we have a very special guest, and I'll let Ben introduce him.
Yes, so today we have Mr. Kris Ehler with us. Hi, Kris. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Kris is an agronomist and a seed salesman for Ehler Brothers, and you are located in Champaign County, Illinois, correct?
Correct.
So talk about a little bit about the territory that your dealership, your Ehler Brothers seed dealership covers, and just give us a little bit of a synopsis of what's been happening since April 1st in your area.
Yeah, so Champaign County, we're located just north of Champaign, home of the University of Illinois, where Devin Witherspoon was selected as the number 5 overall pick in the NFL draft. Just want to throw that out there for any Iowa fans that might be.
And we had 2 Hawkeyes right behind him, Kris, just to remind you of that. And there was an Iowa Stater too. So we're really happy about that for everybody.
So we entered the month of April coming off a really severe weather event on March 31st. We had actually some tornadoes in the area that did some damage to a neighboring retail plant and some farmsteads. But after that, we just haven't had a lot of rain. Had a great stretch of weather right after Easter, and that's where a lot of growers started to open the shed doors and get started in planning for this season, and had a nice stretch, 5 days, 6 days, 80-degree weather. And then we took a dip back to normal temperatures, had a few more days of 75, 80 degrees, and then we fell off the cliff temperature wise. A lot of days we struggled to reach 50 degrees. There were days I was doing GDU calculations and coming up with -6. Just not really favorable for anything, and growers not getting excited. I almost changed my profession to a shoe resoling individual, because growers were literally walking around in circles, not knowing what to do, wearing the soles out of their shoes, trying to make a decision, and it just didn't make sense based off the temperatures that we were seeing. And then last Monday, we had some of those early planted beans, that April 10th through the 12th window that were just emerged. And Monday, our low, we drew the short straw here in Champaign County. We got down to 25 degrees, and we dipped below freezing at 3 a.m. So we had 5+ hours of freezing and frost event. And we had some beans that were up. Those beans got unfortunately frosted and killed. So we're dealing with a little replant situation going on there.
So what are you looking at when you're looking at your replant stands? Is it a fairly easy replant decision for your growers to be making when you get that cold for that long? Or what kind of stands are you looking at when you're out looking at soybean stands?
Well, when we're out there evaluating stands for replant situation, it's always kind of in a gray area. These fields had about 50%. You still had some trying to come out of the ground. These growers were they've made the decision, we're just going to plant into it, because they had a good enough stand to salvage. So we'll plant into that. And again, my advice for growers is, we just, in our geography, got our federal replant date moved to April 10th. That's still pretty early. And this was a great example this growing season where, April 10th and after was 5-6 days of 80-degree weather. Well, that's going to get a soybean out of the ground pretty quick. So if you look at it from a perspective of it's going to take 7 to 8 days of good warm weather to get that bean out of the ground, you might want to consider avoiding the first 2 to 3 days of that really warm stretch, because you're really going to progress that soybean getting it out of the ground. And we know that in our geography, April 22nd is actually our last freeze-free date. So I want to put into my growers, into their mindset is, okay, if I'm planting on April 10th, I want to shoot for emergence after that, somewhere in the ballpark of April 25th, so I can be safe. So again, avoiding large blocks of above average temperatures that soybean is going to try and make its way out of the ground, while we're still in that risk of getting a hard freeze.
When you're going out and looking and doing those 50% stand counts, what are you looking at for a viable soybean versus something that may be shooting auxiliary buds versus a completely dead soybean? Can you describe what you're looking at for us?
Yeah, so I always say soybeans are a terrible poker player. They show their hands pretty quickly. Like I had a March 30th planting date. I always try and do an ultra early planting date. This is my 15th season, and went out there at just short of 7 a.m. I could see the green coloration. I went back at 9, just short of 10 o'clock, 9:45. They started to get dark green. When they get dark green, they're headed towards what I call black death. And by noon, they disappear with the soil and they've become black and necrotic. One thing to look for too, the most vulnerable point of a soybean is right when that neck is just poked out of the soil and you get a freeze or a hard frost on that. When you think about that and that soybean comes out, now you got your cotyledons up here. Well, if you frost that point off, you have now just cut off everything that goes to the growing point. That soybean's done. So those are pretty easy plants to pick out within that. And then you've got your 20 to 30% that I would give a 40 to 50% chance of survival. And then again, some of your late emergers were just going to be fine.
So when you are planting your soybeans on the 10th of April, like you said, you're avoiding your large blocks of heat. What are you doing on your depth of those soybeans? How deep are you pushing them to try to prolong that time frame and get them out of the ground?
So, for example, in my ultra earlies, those were 2 inches deep, and they were still emerged by Monday. So again, I like to see 1.5 inches or more in those really early situations, kind of hold them back a little bit. It's a nice slow emergence, and I always say the great thing about the month of April, we seldom do we ever see a crust. We just don't see those rapid warm ups. Tend to get frequent moisture. It keeps that soil surface moist and loose so that bean can emerge. As we progress into the month of April, we can shave that back. I don't like to see 1.5 inch beans in the latter part of April. 1 inch to 1.25 inches is sufficient.
Good conversation there. What are you doing for on these early guys? What are you suggesting for your maturity that you're planting with?
We're not varying too far off of where they're at because we're still in the month of April. That's a saving grace. And so if they've, for example, one of the fields we're looking at was a 3.8, we're coming back with a 3.6. We don't need to move down to a 3.2 or anything to try and match up harvest maturities in that regards. Again, it's still early. I think those beans are going to, once replanted in, they should be getting out of the ground in 7-8 days, looking at the forecast that we've got coming.
What is the lowest planting population stand, I guess your harvest stand that you're looking at when you're doing that soybean evaluation? What's the lowest stand that you would keep as a sufficient stand for your growers?
As long as things are evenly spaced and it's not just a chunk here and a chunk there, if it's somewhat even in the spacings, I'm comfortable with 90 to 95,000. There's been a lot of research in that park. University of Wisconsin's got some really good tools for that. Sean Conley does a great job there. If you're 90, 95,000 in the month of April, you're still at 99% of yield potential. And again, I tell most of my growers, we don't really have any thin line beans in our lineup. They're mostly some of that, what we call intermediate. So they're semi-bush. They're going to branch well. They're going to fill in. They're going to shade, and we'll be okay. Again, you go out there and you overpopulate. Now you're going to look at lodging, and lodging is going to be a yield losing event.
Absolutely.
Kriss, when you're recommending going in and replanting, are you trying to go between the rows, or are you going catty corner?
I'll always suggest going at an angle. That would be my first recommendation, unless there's something going on with a tillage tool that's maybe given a little bit of a ridge, and depending on the row width, actually splitting the row. But again, I will always suggest if we can come in at an angle, that's going to be our best bet.
So we have this behind us. We get everything replanted. What concerns do you have for the 23 growing season? What worked, what didn't work last year? You guys do a lot of testing yourselves. What are you excited about for the 23 season?
Yeah, and again, I look at the month of April, and by no means have we been wet. If we were wet, it would just change the dynamic of everything and the decisions that have been made. We've been dry, but we've been cool. So I'm really excited to see seed treatment wise how things play out there. Again, a lot of early planted soybeans in cool soils. Yes, it's still moist. Yes, it's still damp. So the threats of SDS are definitely there. We saw some really big yield gains from the Saltro treated soybeans in our seed treatment plots last year. We've got a lot of Saltro out starting line plus this year with growers because again, in our area, early planted soybeans are a very big thing. We've got a lot of growers on board with that. They see the value in the early planted soybeans, and they see the value in having an SDS protection product out there, like Saltro or starting line plus. So I'm anxious to see how that plays out come this fall. It'll be interesting to see some of the corn that's been planted too. I've got my concerns there. Again, we've had some growers planting into some really cool 48-hour forecasts, and I just don't know if germination is going to be the best in those scenarios, and what's emergence going to look like. That's yet to be determined because it's still sitting in the ground. Not where I would want it, in my opinion.
Right, and that brings me to a key question where I'm sure your phone is probably ringing off the hook right now, even with where you're at on how many of your growers already have stuff in the ground. What is your suggestion when it comes to the forecast? What are you looking for when you're planting beans versus corn, and what's your perspective on answering those questions? Do I go? What are you looking for when you're making those suggestions?
Yeah, there's been a lot of opportunities on the bean planting side, but again, I've tried to do imbibition chilling trials, and I've never been able to get it on the soybean side. Soybeans wrap up that imbibition phase, and that's where it's taking that initial drink of water into the seed, begins the germination process. It can actually complete that in under 12 hours, so it's very quick. Corn, on the other hand, that's about 48 hours. So you got 2 days to worry about when it comes to corn. You've got a half a day when it comes to soybeans. And I'll just tell growers, if you're done, just wrap that planter up by noon. Let it complete that imbibition phase in some warmer soils. Sit tomorrow out. Look, there's no rain in the forecast for 7 days. We're not giving anything up. But when it comes to corn, again, I stress the importance of that first 48 hours and that imbibition phase for corn, that it's got to be in warm or warming soils. And that's one thing I like to stress to growers is when we make that corn planting decision, let's make it based off of the 5-day forecast. As long as we're moving up gradually in temperatures, that's kind of where we want to be.
Where do you start? What temperature do you start with corn?
Again, they recommend a 4-inch soil temperature of 50 degrees. We've got a lot of really good black soil here in Champaign County and surrounding. When you put a temperature probe on a sunny day, and it can be 65 degrees outside, that 2-inch where that seedling is going to be can spike up to 75 and 80 degrees. And again, we talk about GDU accumulation. They say roughly 110, 125 GDUs to get a corn seedling out of the ground. And if you do the math, sometimes you're getting it out in under 110. But if you've got 5 or 6 sunny days where it's really pounding on that soil, and that where that seedling's at is spiking up into the 80 degrees, 85 degrees, I think that's where we're getting that seed out of the ground quicker. Now, you might have an overcast day that's 75, and that's where it's going to track true to the ambient air GDUs.
I think Iowa State was working on some data about that a couple years ago that they were going to hopefully progress more on GDUs from thermal units rather than actual temperature units. And it's interesting to see how universities will continue on that, because you're exactly right. We see that happen over here on our prairie soils as well.
Yeah, and I think there's been a lot of really great third-party data shown that as we look at hybrids right now, today, our current hybrids, that we're really not giving up a ton of yield when we're planting May 5th, May 10th, May 15th. But you've got a group that's still ingrained in the old university table that says, if I'm planting on April 25th, I'm 100% of yield. If I'm planting on May 10th, I've already given up 8% of yield. Again, those third-party agronomic firms are questioning that. And again, most growers in our area last year, May 10th and beyond, was their best yielding corn. You can never make up for a loss of ear count. And we try and stress that a lot. Get that corn out of the ground in 5, 6, 7 days max. And if you can't, then maybe it's better off sitting in the bag than sitting in the ground.
Kriss, there's a lot of difference in that soil temperature between the no-till and conventional till. What percentage are you no-till over there?
In Champaign County, probably somewhere in the ballpark of 30%. As you get to the northern part of the county, that's where a lot of that lies, and then on the eastern part of the county. But as you get north of Champaign County, that number continues to grow. The no-till growers this year, again, like I said, we're going to get to the end of April, and we're probably going to be one of the record driest Aprils that we've seen in a long time. So the no-till guys have had great opportunities to get some April planted soybeans, which some years they don't, just because of cooler and obviously wetter conditions.
Have you had the opportunity to look at some of those no-till fields, and how did they fare with the frost compared to the conventional till?
They fared actually a little bit better because, again, being a little bit cooler, they're slower out of the ground. So that worked within their favor as well.
Where are you at from a total planting progress from the state average, or where you think your growers are actually at right now?
I saw the state chart on, I think it was Monday, and it showed corn at 18% and soybeans at 15%. To me, the soybean number definitely seemed a little low, because I know a lot of guys in the northern part of the state and here in the central part of the state and even southern part of the state have been just chipping away at it for the last 2 weeks. I think when that next report comes out, we've got to be closer to the 50 to 55% on soybeans, and maybe 25 to 30% on corn.
And you think the next big window is probably going to be Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday this coming week?
Yeah, so Monday is going to be a big day. It's where we grab the calendar and rip off April and we stare at May, and that's growers get nervous when they're looking at May and looking at seed that's still in the bag. And again, the forecast come Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday starts that warming trend. So the more conservative growers, I think they're going to be in full force next week. Very minimal rain chances. So I think a lot of seed is going to go on the ground, and there's a good opportunity or a good chance that for us in Illinois as a state can wrap things up by May 10th, May 15th.
Good deal. One more question that I had for you here is how much, even on corn and soybeans, how important is seed quality and germ results when you are making recommendations to your growers, both on corn and soybeans?
Yeah, a few years back, we had a couple growers that wanted saturated cold tests on not only their corn, but their soybeans. And again, it's a great idea, and I suggest it to all growers. It's that having that information in front of you, knowing where that seed is at. And if you need to pivot based off of results that say, this has got a pretty low saturated cold germ test, I'm not comfortable putting this in the ground right out of the gate. I'm going to switch over to this hybrid or this variety. And one thing that we've seen that's been pretty consistent is soybeans in general tend to have a much higher and consistently higher saturated cold germ test. And again, that goes back to, why we can get away with planting soybeans earlier and letting them sit in the ground for in excess of 2 weeks and still having 90+% stands and very good yields come the fall. And again, none of this is possible without seed treatments. That is, in my opinion, the cheapest insurance any grower can have, whether it's corn or soybeans. And again, I truly believe this year, anybody that spent the extra money on the next step for seed treatments, it's going to pay what looks to be pretty good dividends.
You talk that next step. You were talking the starting line plus. Do you put a lot of value in the Trunemco that is there for later season style of protection? Where are you guys at on your soybean cyst counts?
On the nematode too?
Soybean cyst nematode counts.
Yeah, so we kind of randomly sampled a few fields last fall, and we saw what was right in line with the University of Illinois data that suggested that 25% of the fields are kind of hanging out there in that, yep, we're finding cysts here. They're not quite yet to threshold, but they're definitely there. And 25% saying, yeah, you've got a problem. And then the other 50% that was well below threshold. So the thing is, these were randomly sampled fields. These weren't growers calling and saying, hey, I've got terrible soybean yields on this field. Help me figure out what's going on. That's a red flag right out of the gate. But again, if it's costing us 3 or 4 bushel that maybe we're not accounting for and overlooking, I think growers need to really start looking at their cyst count levels and actually knowing where they're at. I'm not saying going out there and doing everything, cyst sampling in all your fields in year one. I'd say break it up into a 3-year rotation. That way you know where you're at. And if you see something that needs attention, start giving it that attention. We've got a lot of great tools in the toolbox. And, Trunemco definitely being one when it comes to cyst nematode. It's such a silent yield robber that goes unnoticed. And again, it's until they get to the point where, my yields really aren't keeping up with some of my neighbors or what they're saying. And, I've got great fertility. I'm using the same variety. I've got a great seed treatment. What is going on?
Well, Kriss, I think we'd be remiss if we didn't maybe circle back a little bit on this early planting, and we have the expert here. So the positives, we kind of talked about some negatives here today of early planted soybeans, but you had mentioned you've been doing it for the past 15 years. What's your track record, I guess, on these early planted soybeans, and what would you say why the allure of early planted soybeans is so enticing for us to get out there and get in the field?
Yeah, so let's interject some positivity. Just in the past 10 years of my early planting trials, and again, when I say early, I'm saying somewhere in that April 20th window versus anytime after the 10th of May, it's worth about 9.8 bushel. And the one thing I stress when it comes to early planted soybeans, it's a management practice. It costs you nothing. And how many things in agriculture come with an expense to try and make a return on investment. Here's one where most growers are already planting treated seed. Get your money's worth out of that treatment. And again, we're making a management choice. And for a lot of growers, they want to be doing something in these times when ground's obviously fit, but maybe the temperatures are a little too cool. They don't like the forecast. Plant beans. And again, with a 9.8 bushel return, that's hard to ignore. Track record, 15 years. I will go on record saying this March 30th date will probably be a crop failure. How I say, what do I consider a crop failure? If I can't yield at or better than the county average, then I say that early planting trial was a failure. The other failure I had was in 2019. That was just a really a tough year. We had a Mother's Day freeze event. It wasn't a frost event. It was a freeze event. So it was in late May that we got that freeze event, and I had some March planted soybeans again that got frosted and killed. So when you look at 2 out of 15 years, again, if we're looking at everything that we have in front of us to make a very well-educated decision, the 5 and 10 day forecast, we're adjusting our planting dates, we're using a seed treatment, we're not planting in the first 2 or 3 days of a really 20-degree above average window, then that success rate is only going to, be higher. And again, capturing almost 10 bushel in a $12 to $14 soybean market without really being an expense that's big. That's a positive.
That was a hell of a wrap up.
That's right. And I want to tell you a little side note with Kriss. I've been known to bet a quarter sometimes on these early planting, and he's taken my money every time. So don't bet against Kris Ehler. So I think it's fair to say that that's good, very good advice, and tells you what the odds are, and then you can manage that risk.
Give me a couple more years, and I'll be able to take my quarters to the car wash and get a nice good washing on my truck.
I hope you're right. I hope you keep winning.
So I think the farmers in Champaign County would appreciate if you just mail a quarter every February.
Every February, just send them a quarter. That's great advice.
I'm still looking for the January date, and I bet if I get a window in January and I plant, you'll take that bet.
We actually had one of our reps back in down into Missouri planted a plot in January. He was going to try to plant every month, and he planted in January, and cool soils, wasn't froze up yet, and come spring he goes, well, I'm not going to get anything. Turkey's been out there, it's been cold, and then it turned real wet February, March, April. So when it did dry up, he went ahead and just planted right over top of them. Both beans came up. The ones he planted in January and the ones he planted in May. So the soybean plant, like you say, is a very forgiving plant. Even with the turkey damage, he had a double stand. So it's
That's
crazy.
Fantastic. January's on my radar to try and sneak a trial in when Mother Nature allows, so I can say that I've at least done it.
Yeah, that's right. And you probably will win. And I will bet against you.
Well, that's perfect. Kriss, if you have time for it, we're going to make you hang on and suck it up and sit through the corny joke before we let you go. But before we do that, where can people follow you on social media? Because you do have a very interesting and awesome perspective with your social media presence.
Yeah, so I've got 2 platforms that I try and stay as active as I can on. Tough this time of year with as busy as things are, but I try and share some insights and some tips, definitely on the early planting. Most of those I project onto the Facebook platform, and you can find me there at The Pursuit of 100 Plus Bushel Soybeans. And if you are a fan of the Little Blue Bird, you can find me on Twitter at bean_dork.
Perfect. We appreciate that. So, Joe, you want to take us out?
All right, Kriss, we're getting out. I don't know if you knew this or not, Kriss, but I have a pet tree. It's like having a pet dog, but the bark is much quieter. Okay, I'm just warming up now. One more. A teacher was getting worried about one of his students' penmanship. He said to the student, "You need to work on your handwriting. I can barely read it. How are you going to get a job if your employer can't read what you write?" The student replied, "Don't worry, sir. I'm going to be a doctor."
There you go.
Great. Those were awesome. Thank you, Joe.
You bet. Well, anyhow, thank you, Kriss, for being on today. Appreciate the insight. This is always a tough time to make those decisions and what to do. We hope that all of our customers are safe and healthy, and we'll see you next week.